What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stokastic DFS channel, and I'm here today to talk about some XFL DFS ahead of Week 3. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. If you're listening on podcast, please leave a rating and review. That helps us a ton, so thank you if you've done that. And we are brought to you by Prize Picks, and Prize Picks has a first match deposit bonus up to $100 when you sign up and make a deposit with Prize Picks. You can take advantage of this by clicking the link in the video description below, and it's going to get you one free month of Stokastic Plus Platinum. Amazing deal, so make sure to check them out. A couple housekeeping notes. We also have a brand new show on our Odd Shopper channel called The Odd Shop. It runs Monday through Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern time, just talking all the bets of the day, parlays, everything going on in the sports betting world with a lot of your favorite hosts, Ben, Laffy, Aton, Greg. They're all over there, so make sure to check that out. Okay, we're going to dive into the slate, sort of following the same pattern, and you all near and dear to my heart, true degenerates. One of the biggest comments, or I guess the most frequent comments I got last week when I asked for feedback was, could you please go into more detail so we have an idea of who do we play among these guys in the weeds for showdown? Which is near and dear to my heart. Was real happy to see it. But we'll go game by game, team by team, starting with a little team overview, then get into the player specifics. So let's dive into this. We're going to just look at DraftKings again. Welcome to my account. The first game, we have Seattle taking on Vegas. Seattle is a 3-point favorite. The total in this game is 38 points, which is the highest on the board. And we're going to start with this Seattle side. So as a team, Seattle is passing 69% of the time. That's the highest in the XFL. And they're averaging 61.5 plays per game. That's second. So right away on paper, this is immediately an offense we want to continue targeting. In the first game, Seattle lost to DC, but they outgained DC in terms of yards per play. They just really didn't maximize their extra point chances, and they gave up a defensive score. But week 2, they came back and they lost again. And this one puts them at 0-2. They were outgained on a yards per play basis, but they fumbled 3 times. So I think there's a lot of meat left on the bone for a Seattle team, and that's reflected right away in the Vegas line here, having them favored. And at quarterback, we have the single best signal caller really in the XFL. We're talking about him first, but if you're watching the whole video, you'll notice there's a lot of holes we can poke in every single quarterback, and a lot of them have to do just with playing time. We have a ton of platoons, but this isn't one of those offenses. And DiNucci's actually been decent. He's averaging 5.7 yards per attempt, and he's completing 64.6% of his passes. His ADOT is 7.3. So right away, just examining all the offenses, this one kind of looks like a neutered passing attack on paper, but it's by design. They're using the passing attack as an extension of the run game, using short passes, and that's leading the way to fantasy success outside of even just the offense having success too. DiNucci has been playing well, and he's put up some big scores, and he's going to continue doing so just on the back of the offense. He's backdooring his way to good fantasy scores, even with pretty modest numbers. It's just when you average 5.7 yards per attempt over 35 attempts, it's going to add up. And he's actually running more than people are giving. And that very clearly makes him our number 1 quarterback on the board. So even at the price, can't really poke any holes in Ben DiNucci. He's a very worthwhile play. At the running back position, the big news was Brennan Knox is injured. They don't have very many running backs on the roster. Morgan Ellison is the only true running back. TJ Hammonds is a running back / receiver. And Charlie Temapoa is actually a tight end. He plays the H-back position. He played tight end in college, but he's going to be more of your Kyle Juszczyk style player. So the only player that really has like monster carry upside in this group is Morgan Ellison. I would expect Hammonds to get a few carries here, but I think we're pretty much looking at like a bell cow workload or close to it, expecting somewhere near 60% of the touches of this backfield to go to Morgan Ellison, which is a very large number. And at his price, he immediately jumps to the top of the projections when you adjust for price. So if you're looking for a salary saver, Morgan Ellison should be a person on your radar just because of the lack of depth at this position. Again, Tamapoa and Hammonds play other positions as well. This is not, they're listed as running backs, but that's not their primary position. Among the passing game, we've been targeting receivers a bunch here, and Ja'Cour Pearson leads the group. His target share is at 26%. When you look at him overall, the routes line up 89% on the year, and it's not really that close between him and the next player. Blake Jackson is banged up, but he's been behind Pearson in terms of targets each of the last 2 weeks. So this is something I think we can clearly kind of break a tie with. Pearson coming ahead of Jackson. With that said, they're both ahead of Josh Gordon, who's actually more expensive than both of them. Jackson does have this Q tag if you want to dive into that. I'm not really too worried. He already practiced limited, and it was the same injury as last time. So I'm fully expecting this wide receiver pecking order to be Pearson 1, Blake Jackson 2. Josh Gordon is 3 for me because we also have VZ banged up. He's dealing with an injury too. But in terms of route rates here, Josh Gordon actually had more routes than VZ last week. So it's very close. I think you've got a slight edge Gordon's way. When you adjust for price, however, VZ is in a different price bucket than all these guys, the stone minimum. So he kind of fills a role that's different just from the price. Let's say you're stacking a different game in this and you still want a piece of the Seattle team, but you've used other studs. You can very easily get access to this game with VZ. And again, just to go over the routes, last week you had Pearson at 100, Blake Jackson at 82, Gordon at 68, and VZ at 65. All of them perfectly viable. None of them have dropped below 65% of the routes in either game this year. So great spot to target for stacks. Second team, Vegas. They're the underdog. I have not had very kind words for Vegas. They're passing 53.5% of the time while running 55 plays per game. That's about league average in both metrics. They lost their opening game to the Renegades. They barely outgained them in terms of yards per play. It was pretty close. Both defenses played well, but Luis Perez threw a bunch of pick sixes, which caused them to lose the game. They arguably should have won. Then in week 2, they came out and lost to the Defenders, and this one was not quite as close. And it's crazy. DC even had 3 turnovers, but Vegas struggled to move the ball so much on offense that they fell to 0-2, and it wasn't particularly close. In week 1, we talked about Luis Perez a lot. He was actually pretty good from counting stats. He just threw 2 pick sixes, which was terrible. And a lot of people speculated that Brett Hundley would come in and play in week 2 because he's the highest paid player in the league. He got to camp late, and that's exactly what happened. We actually saw the Luis Perez regression. He threw for 0 yards on 5 attempts, but man, Brett Hundley was not any better. He threw for 99 passing yards on 18 attempts, and that was on a 61% completion percentage. That is horrific passing numbers. You could call it rust, you could call it whatever you want, but it was not good. The one thing that redeems him, he did have 4 designed runs. Whatever he gives you as a scrambler on top of that is kind of icing on the cake. If you could guarantee me Brett Hundley was going to play 100% of the snaps, and I actually think there's a decent chance that happens, he would be in play for me at the price 7,400 based on the rushing equity alone. So I don't think you should X out Hundley, even though he was terrible in his debut, because there's a little bit of meat left on the bone from a rushing perspective for him. And I think his leash is probably longer than some of the other signal callers. They're paying him a ton of money in terms of XFL money. Running back situation here. This is kind of a mess. They're really just using a 3-back committee. When you look at it, there's very little separating Rod Smith, John Lovett, and DeAndre Torrey. That is the exact order that the team seems to preference these players. So far this year, you have Rod Smith 48.5% of the touches, Lovett 30%, Torrey 21%. This is just atrocious in terms of what you're looking for DFS. It's a complete 3-way committee. We just talked about a team on the other side that's essentially using 1 running back. I mean, for showdown purposes, I told you I would dive into this. The preference for this team certainly seems to be Rod Smith, Lovett, and to Torrey. It's been that way in each of the first 2 weeks, but man, this is a pretty disgusting running back room for the main slate. You're probably looking at single-digit touches for all of them. There's not much that really separates them in the pass game. You had 20 routes for Rod Smith, 14 for Lovett, and 4 for Torrey. So even that is pretty split. Like there's not one back playing the pass game role. It's basically all these guys mixing in and out. Slight preference to Smith, then to Lovett, then to Torrey, but not much to see here. I don't anticipate getting a lot of this running back situation on the main slate, and I'll probably go to the cheaper guy in Torrey for the showdown. Haven't looked at that too much yet, but that's where the opportunity stands. At receiver, I might have to eat my words on Jeff Badet. He's actually been pretty solid through 2 games now. Not to any of my liking. I've been pretty heavy on the Badet fade, and that has not treated me well. But even the underlying metrics for Badet have been solid. He's now led or tied the team in targets each of the first 2 weeks, and his route rate is consistent, 92%, 90%. He has the best role on the team. It's even better than Martavis Bryant and Geronimo Allison. In week 1, they were both at 97% of the routes, but Bryant fell to 78%. Allison fell to 75%. They rotated more receivers like Sink Sweeting onto the field. Some of their tight ends actually played more. That was one thing they did more, was run a few tight ends 2 sets. So you're looking at sets with both Brandon Dillon and Cam Sutton on the field. Travis Coons played more, 25% of the routes in this most recent game. And that took away from even the ancillary pieces like Sink Sweeting and Matthew Sexton. Overall, for showdown, this is a team that will rotate more than 3 receivers on the field. So it's not quite like what we see for Seattle. Number 1 here is Badet. Number 2 is Bryant. 3 is Allison. 4 is Sink Sweeting. And from there, I think you're probably starting to look at some tight ends. It's not really that enticing here, but Brandon Dillon, 32% of the routes last week. Cam Sutton, 36%, and Travis Coons, 25%. That was ahead of Matthew Sexton. Sink Sweeting still came in at 32%. Again, I don't anticipate having a lot of this offense, especially with all 3 of the top receivers being expensive. If I do, this is going to be a contrarian Brett Hundley to Badet to Allison to Brian stack. And then for the showdown here, I anticipate being heavier on the Seattle side. Going to our second game, we'll start with St. Louis here. And overall game environment, St. Louis versus DC. DC is a 2.5-point favorite. The total is 36.5 points, which is the second highest. All the totals are pretty close this week. And we'll start with St. Louis. This team is passing 60% of the time. That actually ranks 3rd in the XFL, and they're averaging 51.5 plays per game. That's the fewest in the league. But we have to remember, they only ran 41 plays in week 1. They actually improved to the second most plays in week 2, which speaks to a couple things. One, I don't think we know that the Battlehawks necessarily are going to be slow. And second, like this is a really volatile league that's now only in the 3rd week. We're still dealing with many samples. It's conceivable that one of these teams still hasn't shown all of their colors yet, and the Battlehawks could be one of them. But getting that out of the way so far, passing 60% of the time, that's 3rd in the XFL, which is pretty good. As far as their resume, they beat the Brahmas in week 1 by 3 points. They were outgained in that game, but they did outgain them in terms of yards per play. In the second week, they beat the Sea Dragons by 2 points, and this puts them at 2-0. The Battlehawks were outgained on a yards per play basis in that game, so they've kind of had a rocky way to 2-0, but they've done it nonetheless. Regardless, AJ McCarron is their signal caller. He still, to me, looks like the most just talented signal caller on this field. He's completing 65% of his passes, 6 yards per attempt, 8.7 ADOT. All of that is solid. The problem is he offers 0 as a rusher. He doesn't have any designed run so far this year. That makes him dependent on whatever scrambles he gets, which there are not many, and whatever he can accomplish with his arm. So in terms of raw projection, he looks like one of the more expensive and overpriced players on this slate. Like just for reference, I'll bring you back to Seattle here. I'd rather have DiNucci without a doubt for 100 less, even though, their fantasy points per game favor McCarron. The offensive environment for DiNucci long-term is just a little bit better than what we have for McCarron. With that said, he's still one of the more secure signal callers in this league, which makes him one of the better ones. The running back position, the big news last week was Brian Hill was late scratched. So a lot of people pivoted to Kareem Walker, which was actually a mistake here. Mateo Durant looked like the back, which I made the mistake myself. And looking at what that looked like, again, well, first things first, I think Brian Hill is going to return. He's been a limited participant in practice, which probably renders this a three-way committee like we saw in week one. In week one, Hill had 50% of the touches, Durant 33%, Kareem Walker was down at 17. And then last week without Hill, it was 64% Durant, 36% Walker. If it's a three-way committee, if Hill comes back, I don't have a ton of interest in the situation, largely because I'm just not sure Hill even comes back and takes over the backfield. We could still see Durant get it. But even if Hill goes back to his normal workload, you're still talking about a backfield split three ways for a team here that doesn't have, a spectacular implied team total. They're only 2.5-point favorites. So this doesn't seem like one to really hitch your wagon to. You also don't have the best route rates here. Kareem Walker leads the team in routes. So even though you've had Durant and Brian Hill have more carries, Walker plays on third down. So there's a limited pass game role. Just a tough situation to target in the backfield. But looking to receiver, think there's potentially some players we could get to. Marcel Aitman, I'm going to look at the injury. I forgot what it was. A hamstring. He was a limited participant. I know Hakeem Butler was also a limited participant. So decent chance they're at full strength here. If they're not, we'll talk about who could potentially step up for this team. But diving into the routes and the opportunity we've seen so far this year, we did have a bit of a change for this team, and quite a bit of a change, actually. The only receiver that kind of retained their role was Darius Shepard. He has a 97% route rate over 2 games, hasn't fallen below 95%. This is probably because of injury a little bit. Like Marcel Aitman, he went from 91% of the routes down to 52%. I think that's injury related. And that caused Hakeem Butler to jump from 41% to 70%. I think he's still probably involved right around the 50% routes. Austin Prell dropped from 85% to 59%. No real explanation there. And Gary Jennings even jumped from 8% to 23%. Stephen Mitchell jumped from 0 to 29%. This is a fluid situation where there's a lot of players involved. Even George Campbell, 30% of the routes last week. Just a complete cluster on this team. And outside of somebody being scratched due to injury, I think the only player we can truly trust is Darius Shepard. And he actually comes in with the most affordable price on this in terms of opportunity. $6,400. He should be right up there with Aitman, in my opinion. He just has not put it on the field. He had 1.7 points per game, only 3 targets in each of the first 2 games. The one thing you're hanging your hat on is he runs around on every drop back. And you can't say that about many other players. Like, for example, Gary Jennings, 4 targets on 22% of the routes, or 23%. Shepard, 3 targets on 95%. Like, my goodness, we got a classic wind sprinter on our hands here. But if I were ranking them, it's going to be Shepard 1, assuming that Aitman is somewhat limited. Aitman would be 2. If he had full go Aitman, he would be 1. Number 3 behind these two is going to be Hakeem Butler, then Austin Prell, and then we'll go way into the weeds here. I don't really have a strong preference between Stephen Mitchell and George Campbell for 4 and 5, 5 and 6. Not too much separating them. Going to our next team. On the other side of this game, we have DC. Interesting team. Frustrating team. They're running a quarterback platoon. Pure quarterback platoon. Jordan Tiamu and D'Eriq King. There's not really anything separating this, except last week Tiamu handled really all of the passing down work, and D'Eriq King was basically a gadget guy, but he still played a ton, and he had a ton of designed runs. He actually ran 5 routes too. It doesn't look like D'Eriq King is going away anytime soon, and that does cap Tiamu. But the one thing I'll say about Tiamu this past week, he had 8 designed runs. If he's going to have 8 designed runs on top of what he gives you as a scrambler, that's something we want to look for. The only problem is the offense for DC has been putrid. 37% pass rate, 59.5 plays per game. The plays per game is actually decent, but this team is extremely run heavy. And not to mention, Tiamu's been horrific as a passer. 46.5% completion, 4.5 yards per attempt. His ADOT is actually 9.9, which is good, but he hasn't been able to capitalize on it whatsoever, and he's splitting time. I think this team is lucky to be 2-0 right now. They beat the Sea Dragons in week 1, despite only averaging 3.3 yards per play. And then they crushed the Vipers last week when we talked about their quarterback problems. So I don't know. I don't have a lot of faith in this DC team. I'm okay with throwing darts on Tiamu in tournaments, but I don't think he's anything close to cash, and he's not somebody I really want to have a large stake of my portfolio in. Running back, this is another pretty nasty situation. The only redeeming quality is it's two guys. It's Abram Smith and Raquel Armstead. They've basically split this backfield down the middle. Now, we've seen them kind of ebb and flow a little bit, and Raquel was sick in this past week's game, but he still participated in more of the offense than Abram Smith. Essentially, week 1, it was 55% Abram Smith, 45% Raquel. Last week, it went 52 Raquel, 48% Abram Smith. With Raquel being sick heading into the game, there's a chance he might have overtaken the number 1 pick in this draft. I'm willing to throw a dart on Raquel because this team is so run heavy, even though they're bad. There's just a chance that the volume is pretty good for both these backs. You're just probably not going to get much receiving. Like, we have a 45% route rate for Abram Smith and a 31% for Raquel. Remember, their pass rate overall is 37%. So 45% of the routes on that pass rate is not very good. You're basically looking for a touchdown. Going to receiver, you're not going to have much interest in this receiver room just with a 37% pass rate. So we'll touch on it. Lucky Jackson, I think he's going to play, so don't worry about him. Their tight end, Briley Moore McKinney, is out. I don't think that does too much. Maybe you see a little more Ethan Wolf, and Trey Barry's going to play a little bit, I would imagine. But as far as this team, my goodness, this is not an offense to target. In the pass game, for the potential pecking order, Josh Hammond has a 90% route rate. Number 2 is Lucky Jackson. He's at 76%, but the targets are there. Chris Blair actually has a better route rate, but he's seen fewer targets. He's at 87% of the routes, only 7 targets, whereas Lucky is at 8 targets. So it's very close. Those are your top 3. The problem is from there, they're going to rotate some guys on the field. Josh Malone has about a 29% route rate. And going down, Jaquez Ezzard, if he plays, his route rate was 25% in the first week. Jalen Red also had a handful of routes. He's at 5%. Jalen Red's on a different team. He was just in the group. All this to say, there's very little to work with here in terms of route rate for these players. You could maybe throw a dart on Hammond or Jackson, but these aren't players I really want any part of, especially Hammond at his price. Going to our third game, we have Orlando taking on Arlington. This is the biggest spread in the XFL. Arlington is an 8.5-point favorite over Orlando, 36 total. That means Arlington has the best team total. Orlando has the worst. Hold on, I'm going to just clear my throat quick. All right, sorry about that. Back in it. Let's start with Orlando and the dumpster fire that this team is. They've, true to their word, they've used 3 quarterbacks now. They cut Quentin Dormady for alleged play sharing stuff. I don't know. They're passing 65% of the time. That's second in the XFL. I believe this is because they're getting clobbered in every single game. They're averaging 54.5 plays per game. That only ranks ahead of Arlington and St. Louis. This does project to be a slow game. The Guardians got clobbered by the Roughnecks in week 1. I think that contributed to their absurd pass rate. They got clobbered in week 2. They only averaged 3 yards per play. Their quarterbacks have been horrific. Okay, let's go to week 2 because Dormady's cut. We don't really need to look at week 1. Paxton Lynch completed 9 of 19 passes for 79 yards. DeAndre Francois completed 6 of 13 passes for 8 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. And the redeeming quality for Francois heading into this league was supposed to be his rushing ability. He had 1 designed run. What is this offense doing? What are these coaches doing? I might X this team out. There's a player I think that is somewhat redeemable, but this team just cut 2 receivers this week. They cut Steven Goudry. They cut Dontez Bird. They signed Dan Williams, who was just cut by the Brahmas. Man, at some point, I don't even know who's going to play for this team, which obviously makes this a problem for DFS. Going to the running back position, a guy I do think we know is going to play a little bit is Jermaine Martin. looking at his role so far this year. It's been solid. The problem is his team is so bad. And it looked like it's moving more towards a timeshare. In week 1, it was 2/3 Jameis Martin, 1/3 Kelvin Taylor. Last week, it was 55% Martin, 45% Taylor. So I'm not even convinced we want, like pieces of this. It could just be a downright X out situation altogether here. Even the route rate, like Jameis Martin was just at 26% last week. That's not really something we want to hitch our wagons to. Kelvin Taylor was at 34%. So moving away from this backfield slowly but surely, and I've been playing Jameis Martin, probably to my own detriment. In the receiving game, again, Bird and Guidry were both cut. So there's that. They've also been bringing receivers up, putting them down, moving guys around. It's a mess. The only consistent player is Charleston Rambo, 92% route rate, 93%, but that's only amounted to 7 targets. You actually have the number 2, Eli Rogers, 71%. He's had 8 targets this year, so he's out-targeted Rambo, but you can tell it's low volume and inefficient offense. Eli Rogers, I guess, is somewhat palatable in terms of price. He's 100 above the stone minimum. I'm not even sure I want to allocate that much money there, but he's certainly a little bit better price adjusted than Charleston Rambo. Sorry, Kyle Dvorak. Going to the ancillary pass catchers, they basically took Lance Lenoir off the street and put him in the offense for a 50% route rate right away and gave him just 1 target, but that probably rises here to what heights? I don't know. Dedrick Thomas, his route rate fell from 49% to 29%. Javonte Payton had a 47% route rate. Andrew Jamiel's route rate was cut. I mean, basically, this is a pure disaster. Cody Latimer has the tight end designation on DraftKings, but you look at his route rate, it's been all over the board. He went from 30% to 74%. To make this simple and kind of just to rank them all, number 1 is going to be Rambo for me, just in terms of raw projection. Price adjusted, he's an awful play. Number 2 is Eli Rogers. And then number 3 is the tight end Cody Latimer. He scored the touchdown in week 1. That's why you've got like the big projection here. But Andrew Jamiel got benched. Guidry got cut. Dedrick Thomas, 30% of the routes. Dantes Bird cut. Javonte Payton played a good amount. Lance Lenoir played a good amount, but they're pure dart throws at the stone minimum for an atrocious offense. We've spent enough time in Orlando. Let's move to Arlington. This is a team I do have interest in, especially because they named Kyle Sloter the starter at $6K. I think people have been clamoring for Kyle Sloter, maybe a little bit early here. To look at what they've done so far, they're passing 52% of the time, so very balanced. 52.5 plays per game. That's the second fewest in the league. This team did beat Vegas in week 1 by scoring defensive touchdowns courtesy of Luis Perez. Man, if we could just get Luis Perez to get lost, we might actually have something in Brett Hundley. I've been saying that since he was in the AAF. Let's get back to Arlington. They lost to Houston last week, 23-14. They only averaged 2.4 yards per play. Holy smokes, this offense is terrible. Drew Plitt has played all of the snaps so far, quarterback. 5.3 yards per attempt, 62% completion. He leads the XFL with 8 sacks and 3 interceptions. Not good. The fans have been clamoring for Kyle Sloter. I would kindly like to point you back to his box scores with the USFL. If I'm not mistaken, he led that league in turnovers. You're talking about a guy who's also a pocket statue. Maybe doesn't lead the league in sacks, but I don't think he's far behind. I don't know. I think you're kind of taking a bandage over, a problem that's not going to be fixed that easily. All that to say. Regardless, he's going to throw a lot as Drew Plitt has, and he can't possibly be worse. He's also very cheap, and this offense has a high team total. Kyle Sloter actually projects decently. Completely fine if you want to take a shot on him. More of a tournament play than anything else. The running back position, we move on. Keith Ford, Devion Smith, and Adrian Killins. All right, so the Arlington backfield. I'm on the receiver tab, excuse me here. The Arlington backfield. To break it down in terms of total touches, Devion Smith has handled 58%, Keith Ford has handled 29%, and Adrian Killins has handled 12%. So this is a pretty nasty timeshare, but it is balanced pretty favorably Devion Smith's way. And because the team total is so high here, I actually don't hate taking shots on him. He has a decent pass game role too. His route rate is 61%. So he's been handling the pass game role. I have actually no problem with De'Veon Smith. He projects very well for us, and he's not even the most expensive back in his own backfield. Three-way committee on paper, but I think it's closer to two and maybe even, like a 1A, 1B situation. Smith, I think, is fine. Among the receivers, who are you stacking with? Our good friend, Kyle Sloter going back. It's probably Sal Cannella. When you look at yards, routes, he very clearly stands out. 89.5% route rate, 12 targets, leads the team. It's very clear. Number 2, Tyler Vaughn's 92% route rate, 9 targets. He's the guy I clearly prefer secondary to Sal Cannella, and he is extremely cheap. Stone minimum, number 1 stone minimum receiver on the slate. You'll hear it from me first. I think he's the second best receiver on this team, price adjusted and overall. It's just very clear in terms of routes and targets. De'Veon Smith is actually really high for this team. He's third on the team in targets, or tied for it with Brandon Arconato. So that just speaks to the role De'Veon Smith has had. But once you get beyond this, Brandon Arconato is third on the team in targets, tied with De'Veon Smith, but his route rate dropped from 73% to 32%. They took the former Jacksonville Jaguars preseason star, Lawan Winningham, and elevated him 40% of the routes up to 62%. I think I'd rather play Winningham straight up as the wide receiver 3. But all this to say, this is going to be a rotation. You also had Sean Modster, 13% of the routes. That was a jump up to 45% in week 2. And Jordan Smallwood was consistent, 53% to 51%. So to rank the group, it's number 1, Cannella, number 2, Vaughn's. That much is clear. I think Lawan Winningham has a good chance to be the 3 over Jordan Smallwood, but they're 3 and 4. Then you've got Arconato 5. Modster is 6. I want pieces of this offense for sure. And I'm willing to play most of them. But Vaughn's is my favorite price adjusted. Final game here, we go to San Antonio taking on Houston. I think this is the best overall game. Houston is a 4-point favorite. The total is 36. I wouldn't be surprised if this rises. When we look at the Brahmas, this team has a 48% pass rate, so balanced to below average. And they're the fastest team in the league. 62.5 plays per game, are very close to it. That was because they ran 75 plays in week 1, and that dropped all the way to 50 in week 2. So this is like the inverse of, Seattle, I believe, with a really low output. The Brahmas were the opposite. Massive output, declined in week 2. They lost to the Battlehawks in week 1. They were outgained in terms of yards per play. They kicked 3 field goals and did not maximize their scoring chances. In week 2, they played the Guardians, so basically had a bye. I don't know what this team is right now with the weird week 1 and then the bye in week 2. It's tough to say. They do have a locked-in QB, so anytime in this league you don't have a rotation, that's noteworthy. Jack Cohn actually has 7 rush attempts, and only 2 of them were scrambles. He might have a better rushing equity than some of the other signal callers, which is saying a lot. And we said the same thing about DiNucci. As far as his on-field play, 6.2 yards per attempt, pretty standard. High completion percentage, 68.3%. 8 out of 7.1, so he's conservative, but he plays all the snaps. So feather in the cap of Jack Cohn. Among the skill position players, I didn't have this on Jack Cohn. There he is, 8,600. I'm producing the show, and I'm talking about Jack Cohn. His name's not even up there. My apologies. Where was I? Oh, so this team has had some injuries. They lost Akers. They signed Dan Williams. They cut him. Now they brought in Travis Tavinen. He's a receiver that you'll see for this team likely this week. But let's go to the running back position first. Who could we potentially pivot off Jack Cohn for? You've got Kalen Ballage. He failed a lot of people last week. Jock Patrick is there. John Hilliman. Who do we play? Well, I still think it's Kalen Ballage, but I think it's closer than what I initially thought last week. So basically, you had Kalen Ballage 68.5% of the touches down to 52%. Jock Patrick went from 31.5 up to 43.5. Now, they killed Orlando in week 2. Was this by design? Did they anticipate to take Kalen Ballage's foot off the gas? Or did they just give him a little bit of break because they were slaughtering an opponent? I could see it both ways, but given the propensity for timeshares, I think maybe Kalen Ballage isn't quite the bell cow we thought he was. With that said, he's still a pretty good play in this offense. When you look at his involvement overall, I have no issues with Ballage. His route rate is 27%. That's a little bit higher than Jock Patrick, too. So he offers a little bit of pass catching equity, but he's the player I want to get if I'm getting it back. In the pass game, again, not the heaviest passing attack, but this team has been all over the board. We mentioned the injuries they've dealt with. No Akers, Jalen Tolliver is injured. I think he's legitimately questionable. So to read his blurb, he did not practice on Thursday, and he was limited on Wednesday. So this is a downgrade for Tolliver. He might sit. So this receiver room was already shaken up last week. Basically, we have one receiver I think we can guarantee. And sorry, I just got to pull this up. Where is my San Antonio tab? Here we go. Okay, sorry. I think we have one we can guarantee right now, and that is Darius Roberson. So he didn't play in week 1, and then he immediately jumped up to an 89% route rate. That's assuming Tolliver's injured. So Tolliver's route rate was 82% to 89%. If he's out, I think we have Darius Roberson as the one. On the 89% routes in week 2, he had 7 targets. I think the number 2 is TJ Vasher. TJ Vasher jumped from 46% of the routes to 96, but he only saw 2 targets. So noteworthy here. And I don't know who the 3 is. This is very tough. I think it honestly might be tight end Alize Mack, who's had a 62% route rate this year. He has 10 total targets. He leads the team in targets. But man, this is very difficult to decipher. You also have Deion Yelder playing quite a bit. He's got 5 targets. Fred Brown might honestly be asked to be the number 3 receiver. He has a 27% route rate. Travis Johnson's been banged up for this team as well. This is a tough situation. I'm going to rank them number 1, Tolliver. If Tolliver is out, I'm going to go number 2, Darius. He's the stone man. Number 2 in this instance would be TJ Vasher. Number 3 would be Fred Brown, gingerly above Alize Mack, but tough situation to rank. Our final team, Houston. They've got the goods on offense. This team is exciting, fun to watch. They're awesome. They've been demolishing. Well, they got the Guardians in week 1, so they had a bye. They beat Arlington in week 2 pretty clearly as well. And they even had more turnovers, lost the turnover battle, and still won by 9 points. Anyway, 60% pass rate, that ranks 4th. I think in competitive games, there's room for that to be much higher. 59.5 plays per game, that's above average for this league. The issue is they don't play one quarterback, and it's role specific. So Brandon Silvers plays most of the game. In the last game, he played 42 snaps. McDonald played 20. That was out of 62. But every one of McDonald's snaps, or seemingly so, was running. Silvers has no rushing equity. Whatever he gets has to be through his arm. He literally is a 0 in the run game. Maybe you get a scramble, like 1, but I think you're far more likely to take a sack. And every single design run goes to McDonald. So you don't even have a full snap count for Brandon Silver. It is really hard to click his name, even though he's the quarterback of an offense that's pretty awesome. If you're looking at our projections, you might be wondering why the quarterback for the Roughnecks isn't projecting as well as you might think. That's why. He's ceding a lot of work to McDonald. It's really frustrating. It is, especially because Silver's numbers aren't bad as a passer. 6.3 yards per attempt, only a 58.5% completion. But his ADOT is the highest in the league, so that makes sense. Let's go to running back next. We'll get to receivers at the end. They've switched up their receivers a little bit because of injury. But at running back, you've got Max Borghi, Dewan Lee, Bryson Aline, and Nick Holley. We'll talk about him when we get to receiver. So the Houston running back situation, I was admittedly pretty wrong on this. I was on the Max Borghi fade. Some others in the industry were not. They were right. I was wrong. Max Borghi handled a 67% touch share of the running backs last week. And this is a little bit warped because you actually are including Nick Holley in this, and we'll get to Nick Holley. He's not playing running back. He's playing receiver. So it's basically Borghi in the backfield, Dewan Lee, and Bryson Aline. But Borghi has the highest touch share of any running back in this league. It's just you're not getting a ton of raw rushing with Borghi. and he's still not that active in the pass game. When you look at his route rate on the year, it sits at just 21%. That leaves a lot to be desired. They're also mixing in Bryson Aline and DeJuan Lee. So he's a little bit touchdown dependent, but Borghi overall is still among the better running back plays on the slate. I got to eat my words here. I'm completely fine with him even at 9K. Among the receivers, so here's the players they listed as starters. Jontre Kirkland, Cedric Byrd, Deontay Burnett, Nick Holley, and Garrett Owens. So this throws you through a loop a little bit. Let's start at the top. So I think very clearly our top two receivers in this offense are Deontay Burnett and Jontre Kirkland. When we look at their roles, we're talking about 100% of the routes. 1-0-0. Target counts, Burnett 15, Kirkland, he's down at 14. So they're easily 1 and 2. Number 3 has been Travell Harris. So he did not play in the last game, and we haven't seen a practice report on him. I don't know if he's going to play. If he's active, he's 3. However, behind him, they've actually used Nick Holley as receiver more than any other player. His route rate went from 70% to 100%. Interesting, but he's playing wide receiver legitimately in the slot. If you look at his snaps, he's not lining up in the backfield a ton. And I think there's a potential to maybe buy low on Holley. So I'm going to click you back to the running back position here. He's priced at the stone minimum. He's playing the wide receiver position. A lot of people are going to be scared to click his name because of this weird position. Really, it's an error. And if Travell Harris is out, I think Holley just straight up is the wide receiver 3. They listed Cedric Byrd as the starter, but he was well ahead of Cedric Byrd. Byrd still only had a 50% route rate without Harris, like playing a main role. So think of it what you will. I think this is noteworthy here, especially because the other listed starter, the tight end Garrett Owens, his route rate is 10%. So really you're looking at Burnett, Kirkland, Holley, Byrd, and then they used Ben Putman a little bit. The route rate for Putman was 30%. So essentially Byrd and Putman split that last role. It was Burnett, Kirkland, Holley, and then a split between Byrd and Putman for the wide receiver 3. Again, if Harris comes back, I think you don't see as much Putman. I don't think you see as much Byrd. I think even Holley's route rate drops, but it's an interesting receiver situation. I'm going to play Holley. I think he's a good leverage play, but that doesn't take anything away from Kirkland or Burnett. I think they're both awesome plays in their own right. All right, that's the slate. But before we go, I am going to give you ranked plays at each position. I'll bring myself full screen here. Apologies, you guys have to deal with this. And producer error, I didn't have this up ahead of time. So here, okay, it's up now. Quarterback, top 3. Number 1, price adjusted, still Ben DiNucci. Really, no questions here. Plays on the offense that's going to pass the ball probably the most in this league. So there's just a lot of opportunity for him to backdoor his way into productive play. And then his rushing equity is better than you think. 5 designed runs, 11 total carries. It's not going to happen a lot, but 1, he's not in a timeshare. And 2, he's not getting the Silvers treatment where you got McDonald on the field every time they want to run a play at the quarterback position, or like Derek King, something like that. So he's number 1. Number 2, price adjusted, believe it or not, Kyle Sloter. A lot of this comes down to his price being so low, but Arlington is a massive team total. He's listed with the OR tag on the depth chart with Drew Plitt, so there is a little bit of worry here, but I think this team has seen enough of Drew Plitt leading the league in sacks and interceptions. Sloter maybe has some sneaky mobility. I don't think it's too much here, but that's where we'll go for number 2. And number 3, I think this is where you can get pretty off the board. I'm going to stick with McCarron as a safe play. You just got a guy that's not going to get benched, not going to run. He's going to give you whatever he gives you with his arm. He's going to be 3 just basically by default. But behind him is where you can get a little interesting for GPPs. Just to throw out a few names, Tiamu with the 8 rushing attempts designed last week. King's going to play a little bit, but he's going to be a gadget. I think Tiamu has a little bit of juice because he's handling all the passing now. Hundley, of course, if we finally see Perez get lost, I'd have interest there. And Jack Cohn. Secure role, just middling sort of stylistic play. Not as much upside with his talent. At running back, not too much has changed. We still have Devion Smith at the top, even though it's a 3-back committee. He's on the team with the highest implied team total. They should slaughter Orlando. His pass game role is really sneaky, above a 60% route rate. You wouldn't think that. And even though they involve 2 other backs, he's still above 50% of the touches, clearly. So it's not even truly a 3-back committee. It's him mostly with a sprinkle of the other 2. Number 2 is still Kalen Ballage. Again, we mentioned the volatility in his workload. We did see another back in Jock Patrick pretty involved last week. But again, we don't know whether that was the slaughtering or not. He still projects a little bit ahead of him, and you've got a pretty good game environment. Number 3 is Morgan Ellison. We mentioned there's just basically no running backs healthy for that team. Knox is injured. So when they spell him, it's going to be with receiver Hammonds or with H-back Tamapoa, which I don't think is even going to happen. He plays like tight end H-back Mr. Juszczyk of the XFL. So he's number 3, and there's an argument he's number 1 just based on price. You've got 2 more expensive backs than Smith and Ballage ahead of him. At wide receiver, this is where we're going to go pretty chalk for just the top ones. You're not going to be surprised whatsoever. It's Ja'Cory Pearson. You've got the Seattle attachment, just the best role. Blake Jackson is number 3 on this list. Burnett is 2, and Jontre Kirkland is 4. So I think we could just talk Seattle passing attack and Houston passing attack are 1, 2. However you want to approach that with their top 4 receivers, they're Ja'Cory Pearson, Deontay Burnett, Blake Jackson, and Jontre Kirkland. I would expect all of them to be pretty owned. For my third, I think the best value play is Tyler Vaughn's. Very clear role in this Arlington passing attack, and he's just not priced like it. It's basically a rotation around him and Canella, but these 2 guys have very clear roles in the offense. That'll do it for us today. Feedback, it would be greatly appreciated if you leave some. So comments are great. Just let me know what you want to see in the video, and we'll continue to try to improve it. I hope I got a little deeper for the gentleman that wanted the showdown specific stuff. So let me know if I did a decent job. And if you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, I'm at Matt_Gajewski. Always willing to chop up some XFL. And until next time, we'll be back again for week 4. Good luck, everyone. We'll see you then.